My subject today is the subject of technological revolutions that may happen in your lifetime and their implications. And I start with a small problem, which is that I have about a 3-hour talk and 25 minutes to give it in. Now, the very simplest solution, we speak very, very, very fast, but that probably doesn't work very well. So what I'm going to try to do instead, they're supposed to have up there a slide that shows the URL of my web page. And if they don't get it up by the end of my talk, I'll tell you what it is. But my book, Future Imperfect, is online, can be read for free from my web page, and that will fill in the other 2.5 hours of the talk that I'm giving. Also, hopefully, you will notice some of the things that I pass over very briefly, and will raise the ones that interest you in the question period. My general message is that almost everybody is too conservative in his view of the future. That everyone implicitly assumes that the future is going to be about like the present with a few detailed changes. I don't know what it's going to be like, but that's not it. It's likely to be radically different in one or another a variety of ways. Let me start with technologies that are already here but have not yet had their full effect. And those are two technologies relevant to privacy. And the first is public key encryption. Public key encryption is a technology that was developed several decades ago. Since I don't have time, I'm not going to explain any of the details. The relevant fact is that using public key encryption, one can arrange the world so that anybody can send a message to anybody that nobody but the intended recipient can read. So you can have end-to-end encryption such that if the National Security Agency reads your mail, it doesn't matter, because it's all gibberish to them, and only the person you're sending it to, who has got the private key that decrypts messages encrypted with his public key, which you have because it's public, can read the messages. The same technology can be used for digital signatures, which means that you can prove who sent a message even though you and the recipient have never met. You can put up a web page and demonstrate that it's you. So what that means is that this technology allows you, if you wish, to combine anonymity plus reputation. You can have an online persona. That online persona can be the founder of a new religion, the person who makes politically unpopular views on some subject, the subversive rebel trying to raise a rebellion, anything you like. And the powers that be have no way of knowing whether the person behind that web page is a man or a woman, 20 or 80, what continent he or she lives on. So you have an extraordinarily powerful technology for privacy online. Finally, some of the same technologies can be used to produce an anonymous e-cash. That is a way in which you can make a payment to somebody by sending him a message without you knowing who he is, without his knowing who you are, and without the bank holding the money ever knowing who either of you is. And again, if you read my book, I give a low-tech version of how to do that just to demonstrate that it's possible. If you finally, one other thing, you can set it up so that people can't trace who you're talking to, because using layers of encryption, you bounce your message through 10 different remailers, each of which forwards it on to the next. So that since there's no way of tracing message in, of connecting message in to message out, because they're one layer of encryption apart, unless the bad guys, who might be the FBI, say, are controlling all 10 remailers, they have no way of knowing who you're talking to. So that approach doesn't work. So what I'm describing now is what I refer to as a world of strong privacy. A world in which online you can conduct anything that humans can do by information transactions, including making arguments, preaching, insulting people, organizing revolutions, and so forth, in a way such that only the intended recipients can read it, and such that you can prove who you are. This is not a wholly good thing, I should say. My general prejudices are that weakening the power of government is a good thing, but there are exceptions. One result of having anonymous digital cash is that preventing kidnapping becomes harder, because one of the ways you prevent kidnapping is by tracing the money payment of the ransom, And once you have anonymous digital cash, that's no longer doable. All right? And in fact, one of the things that I have in Future Imperfect is the business plan for Murder Incorporated. Suppose you wanted to kill somebody, or to have somebody killed, rather. I gather from news reports that the cost of a hitman is probably less than the cost of a new car. And most of us, if we really have to, can afford a new car. The problem is that we don't know how to find a reliable seller of that service. Unfortunately, in a world of strong privacy, we can. And I sketch how Murder Incorporated would set up in such a way that strangers could essentially commission assassinations. So it's a set of changes that have good and bad effects, but they're quite striking effects. I should say the National Security Agency is currently spending about $200 million a year trying to prevent this world from coming into existence. And although I hope they fail, I can see that there are reasons for their doing so. There is, however, a second technological revolution where the technologies already more or less exist, which cuts in exactly the opposite direction, and that's surveillance technology, something which there's quite a lot of in England. So that you imagine that in order to control crime, you have poles with video cameras on them. And your first instinct is to say, well, that's just the same as having a policeman standing there. It's just the policeman can be sitting somewhere comfortable and out of the rain while he watches a video screen showing what the camera is pointed at. But let's go a little further. Let us suppose we record all of the feed from these cameras, and suppose we have reliable face detection software. We now not only have a video, we know who is in that video. We now have databases. Database technology has been around for quite a while. The result is that everything that happens in a public place is recorded and findable. I like to imagine a trial 10 or 15 years in the future, and the prosecutor, who's a little bit out of date, asks the defendant, where were you at 3 p.m. on Friday the 17th? And his assistant, who's more up to date, sort of taps him on the shoulder and says, oops, I'm sorry. There is the video of where you were at that time on that day. All right? So we could imagine a future in which real space is less private than it has ever been, because everything you do is being recorded, put on a database and findable, and cyberspace is more private than it has ever been, or than anything has ever been. And if we assume, as seems likely, that 10 or 15 years from now there are video cameras with the size and aerodynamic characteristics of mosquitoes, public places means almost everywhere that can be recorded. Now, suppose we get both of these revolutions. The combined effect depends on two questions. The first is, can you control the link between real space and cyberspace? It does no good for your messages to have strong encryption if there is a video mosquito watching you type. So you would need some way of controlling your computer which is not visible to an observer. Ideally, that's going to be a mind-to-machine link, though I don't think we're going to be there for a while. The second thing that matters for that world that you may be living in is how much of your life is lived in cyberspace and how much in real space. That if by then most of the interesting stuff that's going on is in cyberspace, online, the fact that your real space activities can be monitored doesn't matter very much because nothing important is happening in real space. If not. And if you then, that then brings us to the next step of the next revolution, which is again one that's happening now, and that's virtual reality. That as virtual reality gets better, there's no particular reason why I should have had to fly across the Atlantic to give this talk. You can easily enough imagine, with mild improvements in the technology, that I'm sitting in my office. All of you are sitting at home. You all have headsets. What each of you sees is this nice room full of people, except, of course, that in the version you're seeing, there are no empty seats, because in the virtual version of this lecture, we can adjust the size of the room to the size of the audience continuously. You're seeing me up here, even though I'm actually some thousands of miles away. So as the VR gets better and better, it becomes a closer and closer substitute for real space activities, and we thus move towards a world where the important stuff is happening privately online. And for a while, I was thinking about whether, as the technology of virtual reality got better and better, so that you had not only sight and sound, but touch and smell and stuff like that, eventually it would be a perfect replacement. And I then realized that I had the wrong technology, that we are already doing the equivalent. We are already having people in a form of virtual reality which feels like a real world to them. And the critical technology is not computers, it's the human imagination. Because there are, after all, millions of people who play World of Warcraft. And if you think of playing World of Warcraft, mentally speaking, you're in a different world. All right, you're doing the same thing that a much higher technology VR would do, but you're doing it through the power of the human imagination. Suppose we take the next step. And the next step is what I think of as cracking the dreaming problem. That there's a sense in which we are all in virtual reality every night when we dream. We are seeing things that aren't there. Suppose we figure out enough about how the human mind works so that we can input sensations directly to the brain. So that you don't have to have a screen, you don't have a speaker, you just have a wire leading into your brain, or maybe a wireless system, which can create any illusions you tell it to create. This could give you a very interesting world. On the one hand, it's got my encryption available for privacy, but let me describe this world and you can decide for yourself if it's heaven or hell. This is a world where everybody lives in a little tiny cubicle. His body lives in a little tiny cubicle. And you eat soybean mush, properly adjusted for perfect nutrition. But of course, what you taste isn't soybean mush, because taste is a sense. We now have the technology to control your sensory inputs, so the soybean mush to you is Baskin-Robbins ice cream and sushi and whatever other things you really like. And it's true your body is in a small cubicle, but what you are observing is the mansion you live on the Pacific coast, because again, walking, feeling, seeing, those are all sense perceptions, and I'm now imagining a technology good enough so that we can synthesize all sense perceptions. And from the standpoint of your perceptions, you are living the richest and most plentiful life humans have ever lived. From the standpoint of a third-party observer looking at your body, you are living in abject poverty. So think about that world, think about whether it's good or bad, and think about the question of when it matters whether or not some activity is real. All right? My giving this talk in virtual reality would, from my standpoint, be just as good as giving it in real space, because a talk is an information transaction. You're hearing the same words whether or not I'm really here. On the other hand, even if we had a technology which could give me the illusion of producing and rearing loving and intelligent and happy children, that's not the same thing as actually doing it. Those of you who have read Nozick may be familiar with his experience machine hypothetical, which is along just those lines. So interesting question to think about. But since I only have 25 minutes, of which I've already used 10 or 15, let me keep going. Everybody in this room is dying of a currently incurable disease. We call it old age. There is no reason it should be incurable. The information to rebuild your body is present in every cell of your body. That's massively redundant data. We can't lose it. We don't have the technology to do it yet. My guess is that everybody in the audience who is under 30 will not die of old age. I could be wrong. That's not my field. I probably will, unfortunately. I'd prefer not to. But you might want to think about what to me is the most interesting question, which is not pensions and Social Security and all that stuff. The question is, what kind of a life would you choose to live if you didn't expect to age? If, as far as you were concerned, the only thing that would end your life would be some unfortunate accident. If you say, odds are I'll make it to 200, maybe 300, 400 if I'm lucky. All right? And that's an interesting question, but I will put it to you since I've got limited time. Let me go on to another interesting technology, and that's eugenics. And that's usually used as a negative term, but that's because people are usually thinking of one person controlling what children somebody else has. But what I'm interested in is libertarian eugenics, which is couples controlling what children they have. And there's a very clever scheme in an old science fiction novel by Robert Heinlein for a form of eugenics in which what you're doing is arranging that among the possible children a couple could have, you are choosing which one they do have. So they're making sure that they have the child who did inherit the father's mathematical ability, did not inherit his bad heart, did inherit the mother's musical ability, did not inherit her poor circulation or whatever. That's not going to change the world very fast because human generations are slow, but eventually it's going to change what kind of a population we have in the world. What might change it faster is a much higher and more difficult technology, namely genetic engineering, if we can actually take a fertilized egg and alter it in ways which give the offspring characteristics that it wouldn't naturally have. But that's a harder problem. All right, let me go on to another technology. I should say I gave a talk on my book when I published it at Google. And I started out by saying that I thought that global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe, as catastrophes went, that I had 3 different ways of wiping out the human race faster than that. One of the 3 ways is artificial intelligence. All right? It seems a plausible guess that what I am is software running on the hardware of my brain. I'm not sure that's right. We haven't actually built computers that can emulate a human being. But it strikes me as the most likely guess. If that's right, then as we get better and better at writing that kind of software, we will eventually be able to produce programmed computers that are people, that have human-level intelligence, I think. If we do that, and Raymond Kurzweil, who's been a pioneer in a lot of technological areas, predicted about 30 years to do that. Suppose he's right, and suppose computers keep getting faster and more powerful. In 30 years, we have an interesting world with a new kind of people in it. And in 40 years, we're gerbils, because they keep getting smarter and we don't. We'd better hope they like pets. Another technology, one that's been going for a while and will hopefully keep on going, is nanotechnology. If you look at the world at the atomic scale, everything humans build is engineered in a sort of a crude, gross way with 6 trillion atoms here and 9 trillion atoms there and 300 trillion atoms here. Living creatures, including us, are engineered at the atomic level. If you think of what a strand of DNA is or a protein is, those are essentially molecular machines. It was suggested quite a long time ago by Feynman, and various people have picked up the idea since, that as we get better and better at very small-scale engineering, we can start doing the equivalent. We can start making machinery that is engineered atom by atom. And it turns out that if you can do that, you can do some quite extraordinary things. That one suggestion that one person has worked out in some detail is for a nanotech red blood cell. A red blood cell is basically an oxygen tank. And it turns out that if you engineer the equivalent, you can put a great deal more oxygen into it than the biological version. So you have had 10% of your red blood cells replaced by nanotech red blood cells, and you have a heart attack. And you call up the doctor, and he agrees that he can deal with you in an hour or 2. That's all right. You've got 6 hours of oxygen in your bloodstream. So it doesn't matter for the next few hours that your heart just stopped working. That's one example, but you can think of a whole lot of other examples of things good and bad you can do. What people worry about in this world is what's referred to as the gray goo scenario. And this happens when somebody engineers a nano device whose only function is to make copies of itself out of whatever atoms it can find, powered by sunlight. About a week, it turns the entire surface of the world into gray goo. So that's the downside, potentially, of nanotech. One way of thinking about it is that from the standpoint of what's referred to as an assembler, a nanotech machine for making things at the atomic scale, Everything around it is a set of identical spare parts called atoms. All it's got to do is to stick them together. Let me go on to another one that perhaps some of you have some firsthand experience with, and that's the subject of drugs. If you think about it, drugs serve three different functions: pleasure, performance, and control of other people. All right? Alcohol is used for all three purposes. All right? People drink alcohol because they like the feeling. Some people find that taking a drink before doing something relaxes them. They can perform better. And some people feed alcohol to other people for nefarious purposes. We are getting better and better at making drugs because we are learning more and more about human biology. And it is therefore likely that in your lifetime, we will be able to make drugs which do all three of those things much better. All right? Performance drugs don't really bother me, even though people worry about ones that are used for athletic performance. Pleasure drugs are a little bit worrisome because you start wondering about a future in which a large part of the population is barely surviving, but boy, are they happy. Control is a more serious problem, all right? Assume we've got a credulity drug. It makes people believe you. Think about all of the things that could be done. You could imagine a future where before you can sign a contract, you have to have a blood test to make sure that you're not under the influence of something that the other party fed you. Combining this with nanotech, we can imagine you've got a little meter in your wrist, and the meter in your wrist tells you, don't sign any contracts at the moment. There is something in your bloodstream that shouldn't be there. All right? I'm running short of time. I've got lots of more stuff I could talk about. But let me end by talking about a much more general issue, which ties into economics. And that's the question, can technological progress make us worse off? And your first instinct probably is no. People have been warning it'll happen for hundreds of years, but the argument is technological progress means we can do more things. That's good. Therefore, it makes us better off. But it's not true. Not that I expect it to make us worse off, but it could. Hopefully, those of you who have studied economics are familiar with what economists call the coordination problem. That in order for any complicated society to work, you've got to somehow coordinate the activities of millions of people. The standard version is that making a pencil requires millions of people, because in order to get the wood, you've got to cut down trees, which requires chainsaws, which requires steel, which requires gasoline, which requires coal, which requires mining machinery. You run it through, and you need some way of making sure that somebody is doing the parts that feed into what everybody else is doing. There are two solutions to this problem, one of which doesn't work. The obvious solution, which is the one that doesn't work, is central control. That is, you have some clever person say, you do this, you do that, put it all together. Works on the scale of 8 people. Does not work on the scale of hundreds of millions of people, as the Soviets demonstrated. The solution that does work is sometimes some sort of a decentralized mechanism along the general lines of private property, trade, and markets. I say the general lines because you can imagine a lot of different institutions that have this general form. But it's some system in which each person has a little bit of the problem that he solves, and somehow you have rules so that their solutions interface, so they coordinate, with prices doing the signaling for those of you who are familiar with economics. In order for that to work, however, there have to be ways of splitting up the world so that what I do in my part mostly affects me, what you do in your part mostly affects you. We've got some interactions that we can solve by contract. You want me to do something that will benefit you, so I agree to do so in exchange for you doing something that benefits me. But the farther we get away from my little bit of the world is only affected by me, and only affects me, the harder it is to make this system work. So that if what I do imposes a 2-cent cost on each of 1 million people, we're not going to be able to use contract to solve that problem. So you then start using tort law, class action suits and things. Those are very, very clumsy tools, and they become clumsier the bigger the scale is you're operating on. Right? So one of the potential ways in which technological progress could make us worse off is that because they increase what we can do, they may increase the range of the effects of what we do. in which case we may be reduced from one solution to the coordination problem to 0 solutions to the coordination problems, which could be a very serious problem. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think I was supposed to have 25 minutes, and I think I've just exhausted my 25 minutes. So welcome to an interesting century.